Welcome back to the show. Now, a new report titled Fragility and Conflict on the Front Lines of the Fight Against Poverty estimates that by 2030, up to two-thirds of the global extreme poor will be living in fragile and conflict-affected situations. We take a look at how conflict not only hinders, but rather unwinds the fight against poverty. Let's discuss this further with our guest today. Joining us is Professor Lyal Sunga, who's a human rights expert, joining us from Rome. Also joining us is Mr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen, who's a political analyst at the Kingston University, London, author of The Privatization of Warfare. He joins us from London. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the show. Professor Lyal Sunga, I'd like to begin with you now. We know that many of the SDGs are surrounded and revolving around a better quality life, which of course is and implies that alleviating people from poverty, trying to improve their conditions by making many resources more accessible and the conditions that they live in better. But when we talk about these SDGs, do you feel like they have taken into account the dimension of conflict? Because what we are seeing is that conflict is unwinding not just one, but a plethora of these SDGs and goals.
True that conflict is having a disproportionate impact on the progress towards SDGs, including SDG 1 on extreme poverty. You know, there was enormous progress between 1990 and 2010, where the rate of extreme poverty dropped from 36% down to 16%, then down to 10%. And with the at 2030, we were hoping to get down to zero, the global zero, which is under 3%, because there's always some extreme poverty in terms of transition, etc. Now, conflict, because of the nature of conflict, has changed from interstate conflict, which has become very rare, and it's much more non-international armed conflict, which tends to target civilian populations much more than we've seen in the past. The effect is to, as you say, unwind a lot of the progress that has been made towards all the SDGs, as you mentioned, and in particular extreme poverty, the focus of this World Bank report. So that's quite worrying, and I think that the SDGs were well crafted because they did put the emphasis on the whole human dimension, including conflict and some other of the goals, etc. But the World Bank report is rightly refocusing, trying to put a very strong focus on conflict and fragile states, to say that the last, further progress in knocking out extreme poverty, because the progress has been decelerating now, won't be achieved unless we put a real strong focus on the fact that 3% of the world's population lives within 60 kilometers. Therefore, they're proximate to conflict zones. So that's really where we're at the moment, and that's what the World Bank report is trying to underline.
Professor Sunga, let's take a more holistic and an on-ground view of what exactly happens with conflict exposure, talking about the various socio-economic dimensions that come into contact with conflict and how those impact the individual. How does it basically list out a number of violations against human rights and also stall development?
Well, the way that the World Bank phrases these things is they don't mention human rights hardly at all. I mean, in the whole report, 115 pages, that is a characteristic of World Bank reports and analyses. But they're talking around the issue that you're hitting squarely, which is civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as good governance, development, rule of law. This multidimensional factors, which all have to be addressed to boost the strength of the state and to reduce conflict are the things that make a very clear, impact, intergenerational impact on human capital and the way the World Bank phrases it, but on basically human rights. So one, I think, very good point that the World Bank made was that these effects from conflict and fragile statehood are intergenerational, and they cite a number of very interesting examples, one of them being Rwanda, another one being Eritrea and Nepal, where long-term conflicts or very intense conflicts in the case of Rwanda. And, I've been to Rwanda 5-6 times, and I've been to Nepal, and I've seen the devastation that is very long-term. So that
Professor Sunga, stay with me on that point. I'm back to the intergenerational dimension of this, how it doesn't just stay during that period, but leaves a mark for all the generations to follow. But I want to bring Mr. Gundersen into this conversation. Mr. Gundersen, there is a term regarding conflict fatigue that we hear a lot, that being the term conflict fatigue, and the fact that the world at large has become apathetic to those living within conflict zones. But if we take an economic view of what happens when so many people are living in extreme poverty, how does that alone create ripples in the international scape?
Well, I think this is a very interesting point, the notion of conflict fatigue, especially in the West, that we're exposed to Yemen, we're exposed to Syria, and fewer people care. This is an ongoing issue that I ask myself, are we humanizing the conflicts that are happening? Intergenerational poverty and whatnot is one major issue, but on top of that, we're seeing that there are companies that profit from conflict. So let's not forget that when you have intergenerational and successive wars and conflict, you also have wartime economies, private military companies and others who profit from such warfare, and they are often, of course, of Western origin. So I think there's also a double standard here that Western intervention in such conflict has often been political. And I think that feeds into the conflict fatigue because Western media and others don't necessarily humanize these conflicts. They don't necessarily focus on innocent children and others who are starving because of such conflict.
Now, this is probably going to be a very difficult quote. I do want your take on this. The war economies that you've mentioned here, do you think the economic gains and benefits of them outweigh the benefits of what would be, and I'm talking in an economic sense, of what would be if all these people living in extreme poverty, their potential was maximized, their potential was exploited in the best way possible, giving them a fair chance to life and they becoming productive members of society?
Who's going to answer that question? One of the issues we've seen, for example, with the Arab Spring and conflict afterwards is that there are no institutions to prop up peace. In addition, we've heard certain people say out loud that peace is an expensive proposition. So here I'm talking about political actors who are involved in war and who are profiting from it. They don't want the status quo to change, and that's part of the main issue here, that there are key players who are profiting from the status quo who would basically argue that without institutions who are able to make a top-down change towards peacetime, wartime profiteering is basically the status quo, and it will continue as is. And there are so many actors who don't want that to change.
Professor Sunga, that's an essential point. Now, with so many people profiting from war, it's going to become more unlikely that conflict and violence will decrease over the time. What can happen in terms of a structural change, even if we're talking idealistically, for this to be reckoned with?
Well, it is a difference between short-term and long-term. Peace is expensive, but war is much more expensive in a sense that, and it depends on, yes, on the short term, there are private companies, mercenary companies, governments make a lot of money by rebuilding, for example, Iraq, the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. Many countries and their companies in those countries lined up to make short-term profits, and I mean short-term 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But the costs, of course, to the people of Iraq and to the international community as a whole, from the poverty, from internal displacement and refugee movements, and lack of having a major economic power not fully engaged in the international system is, of course, much more costly.
Right.
So,
Professor Lyal, but this really brings me back to the point that you mentioned earlier, which is the intergenerational impact of it. And I would just really like you to quickly help us understand that, how this, even if this profit is maximized within, for example, 10 to 20 years, how do the consequences continue on and on for decades?
Well, this is what you find in the World Bank report. Some interesting examples that show that conflicts and they take again Rwanda I could mention, but there's others like Somalia and some others where the children turn out to be victims, and it turns out that if you look further down the line, in terms of health, access to public services, cognitive development, these very important indicators, access to electricity, sanitation, and health, the indicators are 20 years and they impact the children's children. So it's really measurable as an intergenerational deleterious or negative impact. So that's one of the things I think that the World Bank report brings out very well. And there's any number of examples around conflict that we see.
Right.
So I just want to maybe add one very quick small point, and that is that if you look at what schools and hospitals cost, it's minuscule compared to what war costs.
Right.
The war, in terms of just dollar per dollar, it's way much more to spend money on arms and to do military operations, which cause a lot of damage. And the other things cost very, very little.
Right. I just want one last question to Mr. Gundersen here. Mr. Gundersen, now, keeping in context what is happening in the world right now, especially when we're seeing one pathogen cause destruction all over, and all these countries with military might are just standing there with shocked expressions, basically. Do you think that this will change the path forward in terms of conflict and violence?
Without a doubt. It may also change how some states deploy their military. Here I would have to cite that in the Middle East, certain countries like Jordan have actually deployed their military forces to have curfews or to enforce curfews, but also to hand out food, to distribute social goods. So we might actually see that one of the few positives of what's happening at the moment is that certain states are changing how they use their armed forces. But I also believe some people are going to question all the spending on war at a time when it's very, very clear that had we spent more money on our health economy, we may be in a better position to tackle the corona crisis.
And that definitely seems like some of the questions to ask, given how our world is progressing. Thank you so much, Mr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen, for joining us, and Professor Lyal Sunga for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, stay safe and stay at home. Goodbye.